So I was inspired to give this talk by John Willis's original blog post on burnout and tech. I think he posted it around last year, and he's kind of done some talks about it. And I was kind of sad to learn that we've lost a few people in our community in this industry kind of due to burnout who are kind of suffering in silence from mental health. And I've dealt with anxiety for a long time in my life, and I decided I really wanted to do a talk about it. And I gave this talk at NYC DevOps Days last year, and I was really blown away about the feedback. I had probably a room similar to this size, and about 40 people or so came up to me afterwards and said, my husband, my wife, I suffer from this, my kids suffer from this, and they just never spoke up about it. I had someone come up to me who was in the Army and said, hey, in the military we're kind of taught to keep our emotions calm and not really talk about our feelings. And he said, I've been dealing with this and kind of talking to people and suffering in silence, and I was sad to hear that. So this is why I'm here today, and I think it's a very important topic in mental health, and I think more people are talking about it more. You see it talked about in the news, so let's get started. So I'm currently the director of web operations at a company called Spring, based out of New York. Been a sysadmin, DevOps, web operations engineer, whatever the term of the week is, since around 2006. And no, I cannot dunk a basketball, unfortunately. So just a quick little blurb about Spring, our company, because they are paying for me to be out here. We're an online marketplace, kind of focused on mobile. We've got all around 1,100 brands currently on the site. We want it to be a place to find your favorite brands and shop on the site. We are hosted on AWS. We are written in Golang. And no, we don't believe you need to have a journeyman license in regular expressions or floating point math in order to write production code. So some of the goals of this talk is kind of to educate you about anxiety disorders, discuss some of the stressors in our jobs, because there's a lot of them, and methods to kind of mitigate these anxieties. And then at the end, I'm going to go over some ways you can help someone who's dealing with a panic attack or suffering from anxiety. So just have to put a quick disclaimer out there. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a mental health professional. Please don't sue me or O'Reilly, but just have to say that. So please just take this as my own experiences. So I'm gonna start this off with a quick little survey. How many people here have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, whether that's bipolar, depression, anxiety, OCD? Go ahead and just raise your hand. So it's interesting when I ask this question. I've done this talk one other time, and you kind of see everyone look at each other for a second and go, what did you just say? Like, did I just ask to read your diary? And if I had asked the same question of, has anyone here ever had the flu? How many people would just not even hesitate and raise their hand? It would just not even be a second thought. And you also notice another thing. When I kind of pause for a little bit and I raise my hand, a few more people also raise their hand. Oh, he raised his hand. It's okay. It's okay for me to say, like, hey, I have an anxiety disorder. So thank you to everyone who actually raised your hand. It's not an easy thing to do. I know that. I'm up here talking about it myself. So a lot of people just don't understand what it's like to have a mental health issue. So about 1 in 8 people in the US currently have an anxiety disorder. It's a pretty high number. And 22.8% of these cases are actually classified as what's known as severe. So severe being within the last 12 months, they've considered self-harm, they've attempted self-harm, they've taken days off work because they weren't able to function, or they just weren't able to function in their day-to-day activity. It's something that a lot of people don't talk about, and people might be missing work and you might not know why, and you might think, oh, this person's skipping out, but in reality they're actually struggling with something that they're afraid to talk about. And if you could believe it, the average age of onset is 11 years old. Can you imagine being an 11-year-old child and you don't even know your body yet? You're going through puberty and you're going through all these changes and you're dealing with anxiety on top of that. And for me personally, my symptoms appeared at the age of 13, which at the time I didn't know. So basically the story is what happened was I started going to a therapist around the age of 16 or 17, just to talk about my parents' divorce and everything like that. And I think when I was a sophomore in high school or so, I missed about 20 days of school. Every day in the morning, I would wake up with these severe stomach pains. I had no idea why. Went to the doctor, got checked out, nothing wrong with you. Went to a specialist, nothing wrong. Just had no idea why, and they would eventually disappear throughout the day. And so when I started going to a therapist around 16 or 17, started telling her these stories. I also worked a couple internships in New York City, and on the train each morning, I would have this gut-wrenching pain that would eventually kind of disappear. And what I didn't know at the time, it was just anxiety symptoms. I was so nervous to go into school, to go into work, but I really had no idea why. And it wasn't until I started going to a therapist and I started telling her these stories that she goes, Justin, that's a symptom of anxiety. I was just like a light bulb went off, like explained all these things that it's like dealt with as, in high school and everything. And you can imagine like an 11-year-old, if they're not seeking treatment or they have no idea, they can't even tell their parents to say like, hey, this is what I'm going through right now. So what is anxiety? Well, here's a bunch of symptoms. See, some of you have your laptops out. Go ahead, take a couple of these symptoms and put them into Google and tell me what comes up. So, these symptoms share the same thing with a lot of different things out there. Heart attack, you have stroke, flu, the common cold, and whatever virus is currently in the news at the time. Right now, I think it's Zika virus. And this last one's pretty important. I hate watching the news. It's so stressful, it's so sad, it's like depressing to me. And I remember 10, 15 years ago when encephalitis, West Nile virus was around, like anytime I got bit by a mosquito, the next 48 hours, I was just stressing out. I'm like, all right, I'm dead. Like, this is it. And some of the things I work now with my therapist about is she knows I'm a numbers person. I think in statistics and, we're pretty logical in thought process like that. She'll say to me, Justin, how many people are there in New York City? I don't know, like 8 million, right? How many Zika virus cases have there been in New York City? 200? Okay, and like, what is the percentage of that? 0.00001%? Okay, so it's a pretty low case. And continuing on that, where are these people getting the virus from? Well, they were traveling from known regions that were known to have that. It's like, okay, were you traveling in any regions that were known to have Zika? No. Are you a pregnant woman? No, I don't think so. And all of a sudden, just kind of working through, and I'm sitting there on a whiteboard with a magic marker, and it's like a Google interview. And then her next question is, Justin, why are manhole covers round? And I'm like, what? How'd you know that? So what's a panic attack? Well, imagine just a sudden onset of one or more of these symptoms out of nowhere without any reason, sometimes without any warning, and you get this fight or flight response. So a lot of us here, engineers, we think logically. Logic just completely goes out the window. I have like a deer in headlight looks. I have like a 1,000-yard stare. If you don't know me that well, you probably like wouldn't recognize it. Like I could be freaking out and you'd be like, oh, there's Justin's over there, fine. Some of my like family can now recognize like, oh, I go quiet. I'm not like really focused on what's going on. And it kind of ends up snowballing. You start like, if you start Googling these symptoms and you start reading about other things, and before you know it, you're thinking all these other terrible thoughts, and it just keeps going. So to give you a good example of what it's like to have a panic attack, and I laugh about this now, but a year ago I told the story, and prior to that, I'd say about 5 people in my life had heard the story because I was so embarrassed by it. But I laugh about it now, and that's okay to laugh about it because I like to deal with things in that way. So the year was around 2004. I was in college. It was the year of Linux on the desktop. FreeBSD was dying. And IPv6 was going to be widespread throughout the whole world. And I was sitting in my dorm room, it was late at night, and I was up on campus like a couple weeks early because I worked at the computer help desk getting ready for students to come up for the upcoming semester. And I reached down to my desk, I was a little hungry, and I went to go grab a snack. I reached in there and I grabbed for a coffee cake. I was like, all right, nothing unusual so far. Took a few bites of it, ate about half of the thing, and I looked down and it's covered in mold. And like, I see people looking around like, oh, it's disgusting, it's gross, that's a normal reaction. I started freaking out, I started hyperventilating. My hands and fingers went numb, tingling. My face was tingling, couldn't feel anything. So what do you do when that happens? I'm literally the only person in the dorm room at the time. There's no one else there. And I'm like, great, they're gonna find me dead here on the floor next to a coffee cake that's covered in mold, and they're gonna have to tell my parents that. So I start Googling this, like, can you die, get sick from having mold on top of a coffee cake or whatever, eating like a moldy food? And like all the results come up and it's like everything's fine, like there's nothing wrong, it's no big deal. It's still not enough for me. Everything WebMD is saying it's not a big deal. I call poison control, experts on this stuff, right? So I call them, they're like, it's no big deal, the enzymes in your stomach will break it down. I'm still not convinced. All these people are telling me like, hey, it's fine. These are I called someone who gets calls about poison every day. Like they're experts on this. Didn't believe them. At the time, I had a prescription for Klonopin, so I took it, and it kind of brought me down after about 10, 15 minutes. Eventually, I could feel my fingers again. I was able to breathe a little more normally. And that's just what happens. Like logic just completely goes out the window. So just because you have anxiety doesn't mean you have a disorder. There's good anxiety, there's bad anxiety. Anxiety is just a warning system to our body. You get a surge of adrenaline, it helps us prepare for something. You might get a little nervous before going in front of a group of people to speak about something, before getting on a flight. I'm not qualified to tell you whether or not your anxiety is good or bad. That's up to a mental health professional or a doctor. I once heard actually an interesting description of what it's like to have anxiety all the time. You know when you kind of lean back in your chair a little bit too far, and then that moment you kind of catch yourself? Imagine that feeling, but constantly. Where there's just sinking feeling in your stomach deep down, you can't explain why, and it's not fun. So why am I here today? To tell you a little bit about some of the stresses in our job in web operations or sysadmin or whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot of them. So these next few slides, I'm going to go over a few aspects of our jobs that kind of make it a little bit more difficult for people who may have anxiety or don't even have anxiety. So the first thing is we're on call. We're part of on-call rotations. You get paged in the middle of the night at 3 a.m, and there's no such thing as a good page. When was the last time your primary database paged you at 3 a.m. just to ask how you were feeling? It never happens. Wakes you up in the middle of the night, you get lack of sleep, you wake up the next morning, you go into work, get paged again. All of this elevates your anxiety levels, your stress levels, and it just kind of snowballs from there. How many people here have 100% uptime in their infrastructure? All right, good. There's no liars in the audience then. So there's no guarantee that you're ever going to have 100% uptime. It's guaranteed you're going to have an outage at some point. You might as well get it out of the way. And it's just a fact of life. It's one of those things you have to accept. And it's scary going into that. And some of the industries we're working in where, uptime could be the difference between billions of dollars of revenue and, actually affects the bottom line. And that's kind of, we're carrying that on our backs. And of course, we deal with maintenance windows, which of course never actually occur during normal business hours because you have to do them off hours. Some of these are planned maintenance windows. Some of these are unplanned, like the latest SSL vulnerability of the month, where you kind of have to scramble to patch all your servers, bounce that old service that has been bounced in over a year, make sure it actually comes up. One of my least favorite maintenance windows to perform, just changing a DNS registrar. So simple, but you fuck it up, and propagation happens, and you're just sitting there waiting, and you can't do anything about it. And then you have all these terrible clients that don't obey TTLs for some reason, even though it's implemented. And we're constantly having to deal with new technology. I've been doing this for 10, 11 years. What I was working on 10, 11 years ago is not even running at all anymore, like all these old Sun servers I learned about. You don't find those in data. Well, I'm sure you still do find them in data centers, but I'm not working on them anymore. And you're constantly having to learn all these new things, keep up with the latest buzzwords, keeping up with all these new things that bring on a new set of challenges and a new set of problems. And tech just requires constant learning and education. And you have all these complexities that we're dealing with nowadays. It's no longer just a simple web application or a web server. Take a simple blog nowadays. It's powered by Nginx. Requests are processed by Django. Of course, your users have to be authenticated by LDAP, and your logs got to be pushed through Kafka. And then, you got to make sure they're processed by Logstash. And, they're eventually going to end up in Elasticsearch. And how are you going to view those logs? You're going to bring up Kibana and view the dashboard or run a search query. And of course, all of that needs to be accessed over VPN, but don't forget your two-factor key. And all of this runs in one giant Docker container, which sits in the cloud, which is powered by serverless technology, which requires no ops to actually run. So all of these things that now used to be simple 20, 15 years ago have now become overly complex. They have a lot of moving factors to them, especially in enterprise companies that require a lot of regulations and whatnot. And sometimes we're a team of one. I'm currently the first ops hire at my new job. I've done this a couple of times now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later because this necessarily doesn't have to be a bad thing depending on the right situation. And of course, we have all the power and responsibility. We have root on all these systems, and one wrong command can bring down a system real easily. I remember out of college, I powered down the wrong server on more than one occasion. I unplugged the wrong Cat5 cable on more than one occasion. A week before giving this talk a year ago, I was going to remove a folder called private that I thought I was in my home directory, and I was on my OS X machine. I was actually in root. I removed /private on OS X, And I was like, oh, okay, I could probably recover from this. I start Googling, like, can you recover from, no, you can't. You have to completely reinstall your system. And I was just like, and I wasn't paying attention. And it's just that's all it takes is just a moment and you're not paying attention. I did this on my own system, thankfully, but I've shut down the wrong machine plenty of times. And thankfully, like, if you have a robust enough infrastructure, that's not, a bad thing, nothing will go down. So I've probably sufficiently scared you of ever going into an operations role or make you question why you ever got into this industry to begin with. Let's talk a little bit about some ways we can actually mitigate and minimize some of this anxiety. So these next few slides, some of the stuff you've probably heard about already, you probably already do them, but I want you to think about it in a different mindset. Think about it with someone who has anxiety issues or going into it and just as a way to actually alleviate anxiety about doing something. So, I talked about earlier being an ops team of one. So I'm currently the first ops hire and only ops hire. The reason why I took this job was because the engineers share an on-call rotation with me. They're participating in dealing with AWS issues with me. I'm not just sitting there on my own little island being like, all right, Justin, here you go. Here's all the ops problems. Now you need to fix them. Like, we're working together on things, right? It's the whole DevOps culture. Your health is super important. It's not worth the stress of just being the only person in your job where everyone's dumping everything into your lap. Like, there's plenty of people hiring here and you can just walk away from that. So controlled burns is actually a photo of me in college playing with a flamethrower or blowtorch, whatever it was. I know everyone here knows about Netflix Chaos Monkey, right? How many of us are really ready to put a piece of software into our infrastructure that's randomly going to shut down things? I'm sure it's a goal or an attainable for all of us, but I guarantee a lot of us are not quite there yet. So a thing we did at a previous job is we would have these controlled burns. So the first thing is we gather around a table, maybe around 5 o'clock after work, 5:30, and we would just pick a service to bring down, or sometimes a whole server, or just part of the infrastructure, and we would just shut it down either cleanly or shut it down or kill it in an uncontrolled fashion. And the idea here is, did it fail as expected? Did this highly available NoSQL store that completely solves the CAP theorem that claims it passes the Jepsen test, fail as expected? Did even the correct monitors go off? Did you even have monitors in place at all? Did too many monitors go off? I remember when I first started working at a Palm Trio, and if I got flooded with too many alerts at once, the phone locked up. And I just couldn't get any more alerts. I know we were really fucked if that happened, right? I would just log onto the computer right away and just start looking at things because I knew things were bad. Was availability actually affected? So if you remove the web server from a load balancer, you kind of expect all right, things should continue moving on like normal, but have you ever actually tested that? You'd be surprised what little things you run into from basic things like this that we do. And of course, there's blameless postmortems, and I don't think I really need to say too much about it. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. There's a couple of people from Etsy here that you can badger, and they're sitting right over here. And if not, go find Allspa in the hallway and just pester him with questions. I heard he likes that. And the idea here is just take the fear take the fear of being punished out of the equation. Knowing that you're going into a situation where you're gonna make a mistake, you're gonna push a change that may bring down and break something, that it's okay for it to happen, and that part of our job is to make sure it's a little more difficult the next time for that to occur. And one of my favorites are checklists. I had a checklist before coming on stage for this talk. 1, bring your laptop. 2, bring the clicker. 3, make sure you had, it was just basic checklist. And there's this great book called The Checklist Manifesto by, I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not even gonna try. But he goes into a lot of great case studies, one of them being inside hospitals and how they introduce checklists to reduce the amount of infection rates during surgeries. Basic things like the nurse would be empowered to say to the doctor, did you wash your hands? And infection rates dropped by an extraordinary number. And also just detailed the airline industry and pilots and the checklists that they go through before a flight, before a takeoff, or even an emergency. And some of these checklists are not super detailed, they don't have to be every little thing you do. You can have playbooks for that. The idea is on a high level, when at 3 in the morning you get paged, you could just kind of go into autopilot mode and you just read, okay, step 1, check Nagios for the alert. Step 2, look at a Kibana dashboard and look at that. And then let your brain kind of figure out the rest and fill in the details. But it's just to guide you for sometimes when you have that brain fart and you can't really think about what's going on right now, you just go into autopilot mode. And then there's dealing with training. Like I said earlier, we're constantly dealing with new technologies in our industry. We have 1 million vendors now with different tool sets to solve a lot of these problems. Go to them, ask them, get your money's worth. They're all here today. Go pester them with questions. Get training from these vendors. Talk to your company about education. Come to conferences like these. Having a book stipend in your company is a great way to encourage education, like a $30 a month book stipend or more, just whatever book that could be related to your job, just should be able to expense that. Knowing and being comfortable also with the tool set you have. Do you know that when something goes wrong, do you know how to actually query the metrics in Graphite? Do you even know what the naming scheme is? Like I've seen companies where they had so many metrics in Graphite, you had no idea which one to query to figure out what was going on when a problem was occurring. Better, do you just have a dashboard that you could just go to rather than having to do this ad hoc while an issue is going on? Just knowing that, oh, we have Logstash there and that's where all of our logs are. Sometimes it's the basics that people don't realize before they go on call that they need to know and be comfortable with their tool set. Train your engineers in basic Linux troubleshooting. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Brendan Gregg, but he has a great book on performance tuning and system training, and he has this thing called the use method. And it's a great thing to go over with your company about just how to troubleshoot a basic problem. Of course, having an on-call partner. So there's two aspects of this. I'm sure a lot of people here have a primary and secondary on-call, which is great as just a fallback and like knowing that you have just someone there backing you up if you need to, but also when you're bringing a new person into the rotation. So you have a new person coming on call, and rather than just throwing them into the deep end right away, just pair them with someone for the first week. So that way they're answering the pages during business hours, you're with them, you're both getting paged, you know that someone else got paged, and you could just stand over their shoulder and be with them and get them ready to deal with like the set of problems that they may be going with. And here's a photo, this is actually from my apartment, it's a giant rubber duck I have sitting on my base. And I don't know if you're familiar with rubber duck debugging. I don't know how many times I can count when I just turned to a coworker when we had an issue and I just started talking about the issue. And before I was even done finishing, I would go, like before they even answered me, I would go, oh wait, no, never mind, I got it, good talk, right? And they would just go back to doing what they're ever doing and be like, what the hell, Justin? But the idea here is just once you start thinking out loud, and it just really like, it's amazing how many times you just all of a sudden come to a conclusion right away. And so I have this giant rubber duck in my apartment to remind me of that. And I talk to it because I'm lonely. So, the last thing, and this one's really tough, talking to your employer about mental health. And the reason why it's so tough is because mental health still has a stigma about it. People are uncomfortable about it. If you had to tell your employer you had like broken your leg and you couldn't come into work, it's pretty easy for a lot of people to do. You have to approach your employer and say like, hey, like you just hired a director of ops who has an anxiety disorder. Like, oops, like, is that someone we want to actually hire? And it's like, no, it's okay. And I know it's on a case-by-case basis, and it's something you kind of have to like approach on your own when you're ready and comfortable to talk about it. I know it took me a while to be comfortable talking about this, but why I'm up here today is to help try to make it easier for all of you to talk about that stuff with your employers and just point them to something like this and say like, hey, it's okay for people in this industry to be dealing with mental health issues because 1 in 8 people in the US deal with it. And also, sorry to go back for that, it also just removes the anxiety of having anxiety out of the equation. Like, I can't tell you how many times that's prevented me from doing something where I was just anxious before I even went into the situation. I didn't even have any anxiety yet, but I was nervous about having anxiety being in that situation. And just kind of quickly recap, we talked about being a team of one, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're the only person dealing with ops problems. You have controlled burns to kind of control failures and see what's actually going on. So you know when you're ready, when things actually do fail, and just test your monitors and everything that you have in place. You have blameless postmortems, which these 4 or 5 are going to answer for you after the talk. And you have your basic checklists, which are so great in so many different aspects of life before you're packing for a big conference trip. You have training, on-call partners, and just talking to your employer about things. So, I talked earlier that there's good anxiety and bad anxiety. So how do you know really when to seek help? Well, when it really starts affecting your daily life and daily routine. So it may become excessive, really intrusive. You don't want to go into work. You may not want to hang out with friends. At that point, you're ready to kind of go talk to your doctor. Maybe they can point you to a mental health professional. And I have some resources at the end here that kind of can point you to some places where you can find a psychologist or psychiatrist. And there's also plenty of treatments available. The good thing is this is super treatable and manageable. At my worst, I took medication in college. I took Lexapro, I took Zoloft, and those are SSRI medications. They're pretty common for treating anxiety and depression. For me, I had one of the side effects of taking an SSRI is I can't sleep when I take it, and so they gave me another drug on top of that called Remeron, which had a great side effect of like making me really hungry, so I gained a bunch of weight, which I was kind of happy about at the time. But they do work. And then you have your benzo class of medications, which you're probably familiar with, like Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, which are fast acting. So they take about 15 minutes to kick in. If you're having a panic attack, they put everything in control. I have this keychain with me right now. And this little thing right here, I have 2N plus 1 Klonopin in here. So I have 3 Klonopin, just in case I lose any. But it's just knowing I have it with me sometimes is just enough to keep me calm. And it's just one of those things that I carry around with me all the time, and it's nice to just have that as a backup. So the SSRI medications, they work great. They also take anywhere from like 3 to 4 weeks to kick in. There's also exercise and diet. And no, those aren't quick fixes, but I know after I go to the gym and have a great workout, like I feel great. And just sometimes, like if I'm feeling a little stressed out, not for like a severe case, like I can't sit there in the middle of a panic attack, be like, hey, I'm gonna go to the gym and feel great. Like I'm lucky if I can get out of my apartment, like in that sense. And then there's breathing exercises. My friend Julia sent me this animated GIF a few weeks ago, and I was like, wow, this is great timing. I need to use this for my talk. And the title of the GIF was "Sync Your Breathing to This Animation." So you can see some people start doing it, right? You're kind of doing these deep breaths, and you're filling up your stomach, and then slowly breathing out as slow as possible. It kind of just slowly calms you down. And this last one is actually really interesting to me. When I was growing up, I always heard about meditation. You'd see it in movies. I didn't think it was actually a widespread thing. I just thought it was like practiced in temples by like Buddhist monks or something like that. And I was having severe anxiety issues last year, and I started talking to friends about it. And I would say 7 or 8 people recommended meditation to me. And I was just like, wait, you meditate? That's a thing people do? Like, I didn't think it was an actual thing. And it's surprisingly hard to do. You go to a quiet place, and sit there for 10 minutes and clear your mind. Sounds real easy, right? That voice in your head is gonna go nuts. You're gonna hear every little motion, you're gonna start thinking about every little thing, and it takes practice. And everyone I know who does it swears by it. It's something I need to try again. There's things like guided meditation. There's apps like Headspace and Calm.com, which I've used, and they work great. But I'm not quite there yet myself. It is very difficult to do, but it's something I want to go back to. My therapist recommended it to me as well. So how can you help someone who's actually having a panic attack? What can you do to make their life a little better if you're like a good friend of theirs? So first thing to do is just listen to them. Don't try to sit there and suggest anything like, I want you to just relax or calm down. Just sit there and listen, ask if they need anything. Can you get them a glass of water? Don't be dismissive. People just say like to me all the time, just relax, Justin, just relax. And it's like, oh, you solved it for me. Like, of course, I should have just relaxed. Crap, why didn't I think of that? Like, what have I been doing these last 15, 16 years? And then, sometimes just take them to a quiet place. I remember there's a few times in college when I was out at like a loud bar, and all of a sudden I started feeling like really anxious. I had no idea why, and I just kind of stepped outside for a moment, and it was just like, all right, wow, all I needed was just a walk around the block to kind of bring me down. I just got overwhelmed in the situation. It was just like music was blasting, you feel the bass, and it was just like you're in a super crowded space. Sometimes just stepping away from all of it's all you really need. So avoid touching or grabbing. This is probably a good lesson for a lot of different areas, and the reason I say this is because some anxiety is sometimes triggered via physical symptoms, whether it's like heart palpitations or like a physical pain in your side or anything like that. I remember one time, like a few years ago, I was having a severe pain in my side. I had no idea what it was from at the time. And my girlfriend at the time went to comfort me and give me a hug, which is a fine thing to do and very supportive thing to do. But by hugging me, she actually caused the pain to get worse, which caused my anxiety to get worse. And it was one of those things, like I know she meant well. I was just like, get off me. And it's like on a case-by-case basis, right? It's like how well you know the person. Like you do want to be supportive of them. Sometimes that hug does really help. So you just kind of have to play it by ear there. And when in doubt, seek emergency treatment. You saw that these anxiety symptoms share a lot of common things with true emergencies. My anxiety over the years has changed a lot. I first started with severe stomach pains, I said earlier, As I got a little older, I started getting like numbness and tingling from just hyperventilating. Like my face would go tingling, and thought I was having like allergic reaction because I had no idea what was going on. And one thing that really threw me for a curveball the first time this happened was heart palpitations. So I don't know if anyone's ever had a heart palpitation. It is scary. Your heart just kind of skips a beat. You feel this fluttering sensation in your chest. And I remember I went to my doctor about it, and he knew I had anxiety problems, and he kind of, we went under the assumption of like, this is maybe anxiety related, but I still had to get checked out. Had to get an EKG, echocardiogram. I wore this thing called the Holter monitor for 24 hours. You have all these like electrodes hooked up to you, and every time you have a heart palpitation, you hit a button. Of course, I didn't have a heart palpitation while I had the thing hooked up to me. So, the doctor's in like, I don't believe you. But, what he was able to say once he ruled out all those major issues, say like, hey, this is anxiety, and now I know going forward that this is anxiety, and you kind of learn like your body over time and how you deal with this. So kind of just wrapping up here, I learned a lot this last year. I definitely went through like a bad period of time, like about a week ago. About a week after I gave this talk, I kind of spiraled. I had an event happen in my life and had really severe anxiety. You can see that's the amount of sleep I was getting on a normal night for about 6 months. I was tossing and turning all night. I was lucky if I got more than a continuous hour of sleep at the time. And you can see this little graph right here. It has no X and Y axis. It's either a JVM heap usage or my recovery from anxiety over the last year. I'll let you decide. But basically, your body's a lot like the JVM. It has 1,000 options that no one fucking understands, that no matter how many things you tune, you're still gonna end up with these full garbage collection pauses that's gonna bring down your sight. And it's a real interesting little metaphor. When I saw the graph, I was looking at it, I'm like, I'm gonna use this. And when it was at my worst for me, I reconsidered going back on medication. It was one of those things like my own ego kind of got in the way, and I was like, no, I can do this. And I wasn't against medication. I was just like, no, this is very situational. I can handle this. Like, I've been dealing with anxiety for a while now. Like, hey, I gave a talk on it, right? I got this. This is no big deal. My family was worried about me. And eventually I ended up paying $600 to go to a psychiatrist for an intake. Like $600, that's another thing, that's a whole nother discussion about how a lot of like psychiatrists and therapists don't take health insurance. It's very expensive. And it was a 3-hour session, which was great. I guess I got my money's worth, $200 an hour. But at the end of the session, I just walked away with a prescription for Klonopin, which, at the end of the day, I got, I revalidated what my family wanted to hear, is just make sure like, hey, they were concerned and worried about me. So I went ahead and went through that. And one last thing here, I just want to reiterate how important your health is over your job. There's no job worth debilitating that for. If you don't feel like your employer has your health in their best interest, look around the room today, look at the job board right outside. There's so many people here hiring. On the next page, I have a list of resources for those of you who actually may be suffering and dealing with issues. You can always tweet at me, email me. I'm always happy to help and talk to you and share my problems. I love telling fun panic attack stories and laughing about them nowadays, because it's like, and even now I'm at the point where I'm in that situation, I have an anxiety attack, I'm kind of laughing at myself, even though I'm freaking out on the inside still. So here's a list of resources. I'll be posting my slides online, and I'll eventually or Velocity as well, will have these up online, so you'll be able to find some of this stuff. This one book here, 10% Happier by Dan Harris, it was a real interesting book for me. It was kind of along the lines of meditation, and it was a cynic's approach to meditation, which I related to a lot, and I thought it was a great read. And also, John Willis had recommended this book in his talk on burnout, Feeling Good, the New Mood Therapy. It's mainly centered around depression, but it also has a lot of common concepts dealing with anxiety. It talks about medication as well, and all the different ways you use medication in those aspects. So I think that's it. I think do we have some time for some questions, or?
We do.
Okay, great.
We have about 5 minutes, but a round of applause to you first.
Thank you.
So if anybody wants to ask a question, I can run the mic to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you opening up. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
I'm a director of operations similar to yourself, and I've had otherwise healthy members of my team start to suffer from issues just from being in ops, just from being on call and having these sorts of constant wake-ups and stress. Have you considered, whether it's a right career choice? Like, is ops just a kind of a dangerous area to be in?
Sure, yeah, it's a great thing. It's been interesting for me because, you give this and people are like, well, why are you doing this if you have anxiety issues? It seems like a pretty high stressful thing. I've become really comfortable with my skill set over time, where I've been okay about handling severe issues and things like that. I don't know why, but I'm sometimes very calm during actually a huge outage. I kind of trust in everything. And I remember when I first was on call right out of college, I didn't sleep at all for the first few nights. I was just constantly waking up, looking at my phone and going, did it go off? Checking to make sure I didn't miss anything. And when that sound would go off, where today if I still hear that same MIDI sound out of my Palm Trio, I start flinching a little bit, twitching. I was really nervous. And it was just one of those things over time, as you just kind of build your skill set and you build trust and your confidence in some of that areas. It's one of those things for me personally, I don't get too much anxiety from work. I've done a lot in the last couple of years to kind of live a better work-life balance, where I kind of really step away from the computer when I get outside work and try not to focus on too much work. So, any other questions?
Yeah, also, thank you so much for talking about this.
Thank you.
This is great. So one thing that I'm curious about is, how do you communicate with your employer to try to employers sometimes don't get that what you're doing is not a life or death issue. I'm sure your app is great, but
right.
if it's down, it's okay. People don't get their stuff, right? And I work for companies like that too.
Yep.
So how do you, when people are on you and on you and on you, if there's an outage, how do you go dude, do you have any tips for communicating it's okay that it's down, get off my back?
It's tough. You have to talk to them, and there's a lot of resources in terms of talks here, and that people hammer home over time and time again that you're going to have outages, and that it's just a fact of life. Take Amazon S3, was their reliability something 99.999, were they 599s or whatever, something really high. Even there, with some of the best engineers in the world, with a team that's probably the size of our whole company working on something like that, they're still going to deal with outages. And it's just something that kind of just through education, really, I really don't have any best advice to that, of just kind of educating them and say, hey, listen, this is just a fact of life. You can't throw money at this problem and expect it to go away. It's just using some of the best practices in terms of you can try to minimize that as much as possible, but it's still going to happen.
Anyone else? No?
Yeah, how long did it take you to get to the point where you felt okay with sharing your story?
I started, that's a good question. I remember in college when it was really bad for me, when I was actually on Lexapro for probably a year or two. And I started just kind of telling friends closer to me, just so they understood when we went out or anything like that, if I started acting weird, this is why I was acting weird. And still I kept it, to pretty much a close circle of friends. And then I started just kind of joking about it a little bit, here and there. At my last job on the About page, I was the chief anxiety officer. And that was just, and I just kind of started talking about it a little bit more, and telling people close to me, and just from then I just became comfortable, and I realized, this isn't a big deal. A lot of people and it was one of those things, once I started telling people and they opened up to me and said, hey, I deal with this too, I began getting more comfortable with it. And you know what, I just went fuck it, I'm just gonna start talking about it. And I remember someone said to me, are you worried about going up on stage and saying hey, I suffer from anxiety, you worried that's gonna affect your career? And I'm just no, that actually weeds out the companies I don't want to work for if they're not gonna hire me. So kind of, killing two birds with one stone there. But yeah, it was just over time and really getting comfortable with the people around me. And then eventually I was just you know what, I saw John Willis' blog post, and I was I want to share my story. And if it helps just one other person, then I did my job.
I think that's about all the time we have, but Justin, if you're willing to hang out for a little bit.
Yeah, I'll be in the hallway if anyone wants to talk.
So enjoy the break, and another round of applause, please.
Thank you very much.